Silas Blackwood stood on the porch of his cabin, watching the mail rider shrink into the gray horizon until he was nothing more than a speck. In that rider's saddlebag was a letter, and in that letter was the biggest wager a man like him could make. He hadn't bet with money or land. He had bet the one thing he had in abundance, the heavy, unbroken silence of the past 7 years. He had sent a request out into the world, an invitation not just to this wild, unforgiving land, but into the quiet fortress of his life. Now, all that was left was to wait and see what the answer would bring, a partner to share the load, or just another ghost to weather the long winter with. The cold seeped through the wool of his coat, but Silas Blackwood paid it no mind. He knelt on one knee in the late-season snow, his eyes fixed on the tracks before him. They were fresh. A lone wolf, bold enough to venture this close to the homestead. For a month, it had been a ghost at the valley's edge, and Silas knew that kind of quiet never lasts. In this country, everything must be faced. He moved slowly, deliberately, his Winchester rifle resting in the crook of his calloused arm. The air was so still he could hear his own heartbeat, a steady rhythm against the faint whisper of wind through the pines. This was his world, one of silence, observation, and split-second decisions that meant the difference between living and dying. After an hour of tracking, he found it. The wolf stood on a rocky outcrop, its breath pluming in the cold air. They looked at each other for a long moment, two solitary creatures, both stubborn survivors of this land. Silas raised his rifle, then lowered it again. The wolf turned and vanished back into the timber. There would be another day dot when he returned. To the cabin, the silence that greeted him was not the living quiet of the forest, but the sound of emptiness. And there, on the oak table, was something that didn't belong, a letter. It had been lying there since yesterday, a piece of the outside world that had breached his fortress. He opened it in the light of the oil lamp. The script was clear, businesslike. Mr. Blackwood, your request has been processed. A party matching the terms has been secured. Arrival is expected in the 4th week of April. He read it without a change in expression. That letter was a calculated gamble. What he had requested was not affection or tenderness. He had requested resilience. A woman who would not flinch from a hard winter or a quiet man. A woman with feet solid enough to stand on this ground and not run. The 4th week of April came, bringing with it the smell of thawing earth and muddy roads. Silas stood waiting under the station's overhang as the tired stagecoach pulled in. She stepped down before a hand could be offered to help. The letter had named her Eleonora Mae. She wore a faded brown cloak, sturdy boots, and carried only a single canvas bag. Her face was composed, revealing nothing. Mr. Blackwood? Her voice was low and clear. He nodded. I am May. You're earlier than I expected, he said. The roads are barely dry. They were passable, was all she replied. He gestured with his head toward the waiting buckboard. May nodded and climbed aboard without hesitation. Their ride to the cabin was wrapped in silence, not an empty quiet, but one of mutual assessment, as they both measured the truth of the land and of their new companion. When they reached the cabin, May stepped down from the buckboard before it came to a full stop. She did not pause to admire or to sigh. She simply observed the porch that slanted slightly to the west, the fence line in need of mending, and the neat stack of firewood that spoke of an order maintained by habit. This place, like the man beside her, did not hide its scars. She stepped inside. The room was a single space, clean and tidy. A bed tucked under the window, a stone hearth, and wooden shelves holding the necessities of a solitary life. She walked the room's perimeter, her fingers brushing the worn wood of the windowsill, then stopped at the hand pump by the sink. She took the handle and gave it a test. It creaked but worked well. Without a word, she went outside, fetched a bucket, and returned with clear, cold water. The first days passed in a disciplined silence. Silas would leave to work at dawn, and when he returned, tired and dirty, he would often find a dry cloth laid out on the hearthstone where he usually left his wet boots. Their dinners were thick stews, eaten without conversation. But the silence was no longer heavy. It had become a familiar blanket, a recognition that they both understood weariness and had no need for hollow words to fill the space. May brought life back to the mountains. Purple wildflowers began to bloom on the hillsides, and the sound of returning birds filled the air. The thaw was not just happening outside. Inside the cabin, the chill of unfamiliarity was slowly giving way to a quiet warmth. One morning, Silas woke to find Mae gone. A brief, sharp, and unwelcome sense of unease passed through him. Then he saw her through the window, standing in the old orchard behind the cabin. The trees were still bare, their gnarled branches reaching for the sky like skeletal arms. It was the orchard his first wife had planted. He walked outside, the crunch of dry twigs under his boots breaking the morning quiet. She did not startle. She was just tracing a finger over the rough bark of an old apple tree. She planted them, Silas said, his voice hoarse from disuse. She said no place was a home without an apple tree. Mae did not look at him. She only stared at the branches. After a moment, she said softly, "The roots still hold deep." It was not a word of comfort. It was a statement of fact, a recognition of what was lost, but still remained. Silas looked at the woman standing in the midst of the legacy of his grief. And for the first time, he did not feel alone in that memory. When she turned and walked back toward the cabin, she said nothing more. But that evening, when Silas sat down to dinner, he saw that a small purple wildflower had been placed in an old tin cup on the table. A tiny spot of color in the rustic space, a silent acknowledgement that life, however fragile, always finds a way to return. June brought strong winds that swept across the mountainside like a living, angry thing. One evening, as the sky turned a bruised purple, the wind howled. The cabin, which had been a solid shelter, now seemed to groan under the pressure. A sharp, sudden crack echoed as a large branch tore from its trunk and crashed to the ground. Just a few feet from the cabin, Silas turned and saw Mae frozen in the middle of the room. She didn't scream. She was just standing motionless, her hands gripping the back of a chair, her eyes staring at nothing. Her face was pale, not with fear of the wind, but with a different kind of terror, a memory that had just been violently awakened. He did not rush to her or ask meaningless questions. Silas knew the shape of a soul when it recoiled. He quietly went to the hearth, stirred the coals, and gently placed 2 more logs on the fire. The steady, purposeful sound of the task seemed to be an anchor in the chaos. He put the kettle on the stove, his silence a promise that in this house, things were under control. Much later, when the wind had died down to a low whistle at the window, she finally spoke. Her voice was low, almost inaudible. He liked the sound of things breaking, she said to the table, not to him. The doors always slammed like that. Silas did not reply. He just listened, his presence an answer more powerful than any words could be. I am not him. Weeks later, on a hot July afternoon, they worked together to repair the section of fence the wind had damaged. They worked in a syncopation that had become familiar. Staring at the piece of wood he was shaping, Silas said suddenly, his voice low, "My wife never liked the wind," said it sounded lonely. It was the first time he had volunteered a piece of his past. Mae said nothing, but she paused in her work for a moment, and when they continued, the space between them felt as if it had narrowed just a little more. The man arrived on a day in late August, when the air was thick and the ground had begun to crack. He rode a fine horse, and his posture held an arrogant confidence. He stopped before the cabin, looking around as if appraising a piece of property. "I'm looking for a woman named Nora," he said loudly, his voice out of place in the quiet of the valley. Silas was on the porch, and his body went tense. Mae emerged from behind the cabin, a few herbs still in her hand. She froze when she heard the name. The man, James, smirked when he saw her. "So here you are, you hide well." "There's no one named Nora here," Mae answered, her voice as cool and level as a winter lake. "My name is Mae." James's eyes flickered from her to Silas in a challenging, appraising gaze. "Looks like you found yourself a new protector. A quieter one, it seems," he chuckled. "But you know, what's mine is always mine." Mae stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Silas. She was no longer the woman who had trembled in the windy night. Her voice was steady. "There is nothing for you here, James. Be on your way." James looked into her unflinching eyes, then at the man who stood as still as a rock beside her. He recognized something he could not fight, not violence, but a peace he could never touch. He muttered a curse, turned his horse, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust to settle back into the afternoon silence. After James left, a new kind of quiet settled over the valley. The dust was gone, but the echo of the confrontation remained. That night, they did not speak of what had happened. There was no need. When Silas slid the bolt on the door, he paused. For a fraction of a second longer than usual, an almost imperceptible hesitation. It was a wordless action, an affirmation more certain than any promise. The danger is outside. In here, you are safe. September came, bringing with it a Christmas to the air and a sky of impossible blue. Autumn painted the hills gold, and they worked side by side in a rhythm that needed no discussion. They harvested the small bounty the tough land offered: potatoes, squash, and the last of the wild berries. Their labor was no longer two separate tasks performed under one roof. It had become a shared effort, a conscious preparation for their coming winter. One afternoon, as they were stacking wood in the shed, Mae paused and looked toward the cabin. A thin ribbon of white smoke rose from the chimney, dissolving into the sharp, clean air. "When I came here," she began, her voice low and even, "I was just looking for a place to stop. A place where I didn't have to look over my shoulder." Silas stopped his work, listening. She turned to him, her eyes clear and direct. "I thought that place was this land, the stillness of these mountains. But I was wrong." She paused, letting the words find their proper weight. "It isn't a place, Silas. It's you." The air seemed to hold still between them. Her words, simple and true, hung in the space, carrying more weight than all the storms they had weathered. Silas looked deep into her eyes, and for a moment, the defensive wall he had built around his heart for so many years seemed to dissolve. He did not answer with words. He had no words for a moment like this. Instead, he stepped forward, and for the first time he reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. It was a hesitant gesture, almost a question, but it held all the respect, the gratitude, and the deep affection he never thought he would feel again. Mae did not pull away. She leaned into his hand softly, a gesture of complete acceptance. They stood there in the silence of the fading afternoon as the last golden leaves fell around them, and they both understood they were no longer searching. They were home. November arrived, bringing with it a profound stillness. The sky was the color of steel, and the first winds of winter carried the scent of coming snow. Life inside the cabin slowed, following the rhythm of the fire in the hearth. The fire was no longer just for warmth. It had become the heart of the world they had built together. One evening, as Mae was folding a wool blanket, she noticed a small object on the table by the window. It was a little wooden box, carefully carved from pine, its corners sanded smooth. She knew at once it was the work of Silas's hands. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bit of cotton, was a tiny cluster of dark seeds. Silas was sitting by the fire, watching her. "They're from the wild rose," he said softly. "I saw it blooming on the south ridge this summer. They're resilient." Mae carefully picked up a single seed, feeling its small weight in her palm. A seed, a promise of life, of color, of something. Planted not for necessity, but simply for beauty. For all her years, she had only thought of how to survive tomorrow. No one had ever thought to plant beauty for her. A knot formed in her throat, but she did not cry. Tears belonged to another person, another time. She set the box down and walked toward Silas. He looked up, a hint of uncertainty in his eyes, as if unsure of her reaction. She said nothing. She simply knelt before him, placing her hands on his knees in a gesture of equality and belonging. Then, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was not a kiss of burning passion or of pent-up longing. It was quiet, certain, and deep. It tasted of wood smoke, of the cold air outside, and of a peace that had been dearly won. It was a confirmation, a homecoming. When she drew back, they simply looked at each other in the flickering firelight. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, laying a white blanket over the sleeping land. The rose seeds would rest safely in their wooden box through the winter, waiting for the thaw. But inside the warm cabin, between two people who had learned to find shelter in silence, a love more resilient than the hardiest wildflower had long since taken root, and now it was quietly beginning to bloom.